Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging straight into a fascinating, if sometimes unsettling, corner of economic thought, the conspiracy theories surrounding tariffs.
That's right. You've sent us a really thought-provoking collection of material, this pasted text, brimming with different angles on what the real story might be when governments decide to, you know, impose taxes on imports and create barriers to trade.
Exactly. Our goal isn't really to debunk every far-fetched idea out there, nor is it to champion any single perspective. Instead, we want to unpack these theories, kind of get a handle on the logic that drives them no matter how unconventional it might seem, and really weigh up how plausible they are.
Right.
We're here to ensure you come away well-informed and engaged with a clearer understanding of this complex topic without feeling like overwhelmed by economic jargon.
Mm-hmm.
And we're kicking things off with a classic. The idea that tariffs are secretly intended to reduce the wealth of billionaires, what some might call, tinfoil hat thinking, the belief in hidden agendas and secret plots.
Okay, let's unpack this initial tinfoil hat concept. The thinking goes that tariffs disrupt the smooth flow of goods across borders, right? Which hits sectors where the ultra-wealthy have massive investments. Think technology, manufacturing, big retail.
Yeah.
Therefore, a sudden hike in tariffs could send stock prices tumbling and shrink those enormous billionaire fortunes. We're talking about figures like Elon Musk with Tesla's extensive operations in China, or Jeff Bezos and Amazon's reliance on a global supply chain. They'd feel the pressure, wouldn't they?
That's the initial assumption, yeah. However, as your sources point out, these titans of industry aren't exactly defenseless.
Not at all.
They have vast resources at their disposal, legal teams, financial experts allowing them to adapt. They can shift production locations, lobby for exemptions from tariff, or even simply factor the increased costs into their prices, ultimately passing them on to us, the consumers. So while intuitively appealing to populist sentiments, the billionaire takedown theory kind of overlooks the sophisticated mechanisms the wealthy employ to mitigate economic shocks, making tariffs a pretty ineffective and imprecise tool for this purpose.
And the source material reminds us of a key historical example: the steel and aluminum tariffs introduced back in 2018. While the theory might suggest widespread losses for the super rich, the reality was, well, more nuanced.
Right.
Some billionaires, particularly those with significant holdings in domestic steel production, actually saw their wealth increase. This highlights the fact that the very wealthy often have diversified interests beyond just those sectors directly impacted by trade, with substantial assets in areas like real estate, finance, or emerging tech like AI, making them a rather elusive target for broad-stroke policies like tariffs.
Which neatly leads us to the next theory, one that perhaps resonates more directly with many people: the notion that tariffs are actually designed to negatively impact the average person, which your source playfully refers to as Z-peoples.
All right, tinfoil hat back on, figuratively speaking. The logic here is quite direct. Tariffs on imported goods lead to higher prices for consumers. Simple as that.
Yeah, everything gets more expensive.
Everything from electronics and clothing to cars and household items could become more expensive. Suddenly, the same amount of money buys less. Additionally, disruptions to global supply chains caused by tariffs can lead to job losses in sectors like retail, logistics, and manufacturing that rely on international trade. Tariffs, while often presented as protective measures, historically tend to disproportionately burden the average consumer through increased costs, highlighting a potential, disconnect between political rhetoric and economic reality.
What's fascinating here is the historical precedent that your source material highlights: the 2018 U.S.-China trade war. Studies, like those from the National Bureau of Economic Research, estimated that this trade dispute cost U.S. consumers over $40 billion annually.
Wow, $40 billion.
Yeah. Certain sectors of the economy, particularly agricultural producers facing retaliatory tariffs from China, experienced significant hardship. Now, for the conspiracy angle, could a government or some hidden power intentionally want to keep the general population economically stressed, perhaps to distract them or maintain social control? Higher costs of living and economic uncertainty could certainly dampen public morale and potentially widen the economic divide. Your source even draws a parallel to the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930, which are widely believed to have worsened the Great Depression.
Precisely. The idea of control through engineered economic hardship. However, again, the source offers a crucial counterpoint. Tariffs are a remarkably sloppy weapon if the goal is to specifically harm the average person without significant repercussion.
Right. It's not exactly precise.
No. Politicians advocating for tariffs risk considerable backlash from voters when they see their everyday expenses rising. Furthermore, as we discussed earlier, the economic elite aren't entirely immune. Their own business empires can also be negatively affected.
Uh-huh.
Additionally, governments often frame tariffs with seemingly populist justifications like protecting domestic jobs, which doesn't exactly align with the narrative of secretly wanting to impoverish the masses.
So, while the average person often does bear a significant portion of the impact, the idea of a deliberate conspiracy seems less probable than, say, unintended consequences, or maybe just poorly thought out economic strategies.
Seems more likely, yeah.
Okay, let's venture further down the rabbit hole. What other more elaborate tinfoil hat schemes might emerge from the initial act of imposing tariffs?
Okay, here's where things get really interesting. Your source material presents a whole range of more outlandish theories, each building upon the potential economic instabilities triggered by tariffs. Let's begin with the concept of a global currency reset.
Okay.
The theory suggests that a major trade war, fueled by widespread and escalating tariffs, could trigger significant inflation and erode global trust in the stability of the U.S. economy.
Right, like faith in the dollar.
It's exactly. Persistent tariffs leading to sustained inflation could erode the purchasing power of the dollar and incentivize other nations to seek alternative currencies for international trade, gradually undermining its reserve currency status. This loss of confidence could then pave the way for a new global reserve currency, perhaps a digital yuan or maybe a system backed by the IMF.
And who wins in that scenario?
Well, those holding assets outside the traditional financial system, like gold or cryptocurrencies, potentially, while those with assets primarily in dollar-denominated forms would see their value decrease. The source even notes the market jitters back in 2018 during the tariff disputes as a potential early indicator.
That's quite a scenario. A huge shift. What's next?
Next, we have the corporate puppet strings theory. This idea posits that tariffs are a carefully orchestrated maneuver by powerful corporations to further consolidate their dominance.
Okay, how does that work?
The scenario unfolds like this. Large corporations, with their extensive lobbying power, push for targeted tariffs that specifically disadvantage smaller competitors, while simultaneously securing exemptions or subsidies for themselves through, behind-the-scenes negotiations.
Rigging the game.
Pretty much. Your source points to instances where some U.S. steel companies benefited from the Trump administration's tariffs, while others quietly received waivers, suggesting a smaller-scale example of this kind of selective application and potential manipulation.
That paints a picture of a very uneven playing field. What other theories are out there?
Then there's the climate chaos cover. This theory suggests that tariffs are being used to force a shift towards local production under the guise of environmental benefits.
Okay, sound good so far.
But the true underlying agenda is supposedly a form of climate lockdown, characterized by higher prices and shortages that ultimately restrict people's freedom of movement and consumption. The supply chain disruptions experienced in the 2020s are often cited within this narrative as a sort of precursor or conditioning.
Wow, that takes a rather dystopian turn. Very dark. What about tech?
The AI takeover setup. This theory proposes that tariffs are deliberately intended to weaken traditional manufacturing sectors and accelerate the adoption of automation technologies.
Benefiting who?
The beneficiaries. Tech billionaires like Elon Musk, who are heavily invested in artificial intelligence and robotics. As human labor becomes more expensive or less reliable due to tariff-induced disruptions, businesses are incentivized to invest in AI-powered solutions, potentially leading to widespread job displacement. The source mentions China's increasing use of robots in manufacturing as a way to potentially circumvent tariffs as a point of, quote, evidence for this theory.
So we've covered potential impacts on currency, corporations, climate, and AI. What other areas are implicated?
We then delve into the realm of food supply with the food chain control theory. This one suggests that tariffs on agricultural imports are a deliberate strategy to drive up domestic food prices, create shortages, and ultimately force populations to become reliant on government or corporate-controlled food alternatives.
Like lab-grown meat.
Yeah, or heavily processed foods. The impact on soybean farmers during the 2018 trade disputes is often referenced as an early example of how tariffs can disrupt agricultural markets.
And the final, most far-reaching of these theories.
Finally, we have war bait. This theory posits that tariffs are intentionally being used to escalate international trade tensions to a breaking point, ultimately leading to resource conflicts and even full-scale wars.
God.
As nations become increasingly protectionist and competitive for scarce resources, the risk of military confrontation rises, with the military-industrial complex being the ultimate beneficiary. The source draws a historical parallel to the trade protectionism that preceded World War II.
Wow, okay. That's quite a spectrum of potential hidden agendas lurking beneath seemingly straightforward trade policies.
Indeed, as your source astutely points out, each theory takes real-world effects of tariffs, economic pressures, shifts in power, general uncertainty, and connects them in often dramatic and unsettling ways. The common threads tend to involve a perceived adversary, be it global elites, powerful corporations, or foreign nations, a motivating factor like control, profit, or radical global transformation, with tariffs conveniently serving as the initial trigger or tool.
It's almost a full house of economic anxieties, but what if we shift our perspective slightly? What if the primary focus isn't on uncovering the true motives behind the tariffs themselves, but rather on understanding how these conspiracy theories gain traction and spread, almost like those balloons carrying Grandpa's house in the movie Up?
That's a really insightful pivot. Instead of trying to identify the shadowy figures pulling the strings of tariff policy, we consider the dynamic nature of the conspiracy theories themselves.
Right.
The source uses a wonderful analogy. Just as the house in Up was lifted by numerous balloons, the initial economic disruption of tariffs, rising prices, supply chain issues can lead to a multitude of these tinfoil hat takes proliferating online.
Ah, I see.
Each theory seems to generate even more, creating a kind of self-sustaining cycle of paranoia.
Exactly. The snowball effect in the digital age. Someone online sees a post about tariffs leading to war, and then they stumble upon a thread detailing corporate control through tariffs and another warning of climate lockdowns disguised as green policy. Suddenly, they're not just concerned about trade, they're convinced of a vast interconnected conspiracy. It becomes less about the factual basis of any single theory and more about the collective momentum of fear and speculation.
And the source rightly emphasizes how easily misinformation can spread in our interconnected world. Consider something like Pizzagate, a completely baseless narrative that went from an obscure online forum to having real-world consequences in a very short time.
Yeah, terrifying.
Tariffs, being a complex and often unpopular policy, provide fertile ground for such narratives to take root and spread rapidly.
And we can't overlook the role of social media platforms, particularly X, which, as your source points out, has been shown in studies to amplify outrage and spread emotional content significantly faster than factual information.
Right, facts travel slowly.
Yeah. Combine that with pre-existing economic anxieties, and you have a perfect environment for these theories to gain traction and spread like wildfire. It's not just one house floating away. Entire communities can get caught in this updraft of suspicion.
What's particularly insightful is the source's observation that a single central orchestrator isn't necessarily required for these theories to take hold and spread.
Interesting.
Instead, the source suggests that our own inherent tendencies towards fear, speculation, and the rapid dissemination of information, or often misinformation in our digitally connected world, are the primary drivers. We, in a sense, are the ones inflating those balloons lifting Grandpa's house. We have met the enemy, and he is us, as the source puts it.
It's almost as if this collective anxiety, fueled by economic uncertainty, finds an outlet online, transforming a relatively technical policy like tariffs into fodder for elaborate and often frightening scenarios. The source draws a parallel to historical periods of widespread paranoia, like the Cold War, where every event was seen through the lens of potential conflict, or the Great Reset fears during the supply chain disruptions of the early 2020s. So perhaps the crucial question isn't just about the hidden motives behind tariffs, but about our own susceptibility to creating and believing in these intricate webs of conspiracy in times of uncertainty.
Exactly. We've journeyed through this landscape of tariff conspiracy theories, from, toppling billionaires to the specter of global currency resets, and now we find ourselves at a rather critical vantage point. As the source aptly puts it, it's a long way from the top if you got to rock and roll.
That's a great way to frame it. We've built this whole edifice of theories, amplified the volume of speculation, and now we, the audience of this unfolding drama, are kind of caught up in the energy of our own creation.
Yeah, we're in the thick of it.
Tariffs might have been the initial chord, but we've collectively composed this sprawling concept album of economic paranoia. So, with all these theories circulating, these metaphorical balloons carrying away our collective understanding, what can those who want to bring some factual grounding to the conversation do? What can the frustrated marksmen, as the source calls them, do when so many houses have already drifted out of reach?
Well, the source proposes three potential strategies for those seeking to counter these runaway theories. First, focus on the largest and most vulnerable targets, the most widely spread and easily debunked theories that have captured a significant audience.
Target the big ones.
Yeah. A well-aimed shot of factual evidence and credible data might not convince the most committed believers, but it could influence those who are still uncertain or haven't fully bought into the narrative.
But as the source cautions, the ammunition needs to be precise, and credible vague reassurances or dismissive statements are unlikely to pierce through the layers of suspicion. Gotta have the facts straight.
Exactly. You need solid data. The second strategy is to form a posse, recognizing that individual efforts to counter misinformation are often overwhelmed.
Safety in numbers.
Kinda. A coordinated approach involving fact-checkers, voices of reason, and even those who can effectively use humor to highlight the absurdity of some claims could cover more ground and potentially have a greater impact. The source even references Snopes debunking urban legends as a historical model.
Ah, like a digital neighborhood watch.
Something like that. The idea isn't to debunk every single theory individually, but to create a stronger signal of accurate information that can cut through the noise.
And the third tactic sounds more subtle.
It is. It involves using doubt strategically to encourage the theories to undermine themselves. By posing critical questions within online discussions like, if these tariffs are intended to cause widespread starvation, why are large agricultural corporations still reporting strong profits? Oh, you can prompt theorists to confront inconsistencies.
Planting seeds of doubt.
Exactly. It's more about creating internal fractures than external attacks, like asking someone who believes the Earth is flat to explain why ships disappear hull first over the horizon.
A perfect analogy. However, the source also realistically acknowledges the significant obstacles, the sheer number of theories, the speed they spread online.
Yeah, it's tough. Which naturally leads to the question, what are we potentially overlooking in this complex picture? What underlying biases might be influencing the proliferation of these theories and obscuring a more balanced understanding?
That's a crucial point. We've been so focused on the grand narratives that we might be missing some key underlying factors and ingrained biases. The source highlights several potential blind spots. For instance, who are the quiet beneficiaries of tariffs?
Good question.
While much discussion focuses on harm to consumers, maybe domestic manufacturers in certain protected sectors, or even specific foreign players who navigate the tariffs well, might be gaining. The example of some U.S. steel producers benefiting after the 2018 tariffs comes to mind again.
And what about the less sensational explanations? The source raises the possibility of the boring truth, that tariffs might simply be clumsy policymaking, maybe driven by short-term political goals, rather than any elaborate conspiracy.
Yeah, just bad policy, not a grand plot.
The mundane reality of bureaucratic missteps or unintended consequences might not be as captivating, but it remains a distinct possibility we should consider.
We've also largely been looking at this from a U.S.-centric perspective, haven't we?
Exactly. We need to consider the global ripple effect. How are other nations responding? What retaliatory tariffs are being implemented? How are developing economies adapting? The source mentions India's increasing focus on domestic tech production as one example.
Right.
Furthermore, the long-term consequences might not be immediate. The time lag between policy and its full impact can be significant. We need to look beyond the headlines.
Beyond these potential oversights, what inherent biases might be coloring our interpretation and making conspiracies seem more alluring?
The source points to several common cognitive biases. Conspiracy bias, our innate tendency to seek hidden motives. Negativity bias, giving more weight to negative info. Availability bias, focusing on what's prominent online.
Okay.
Yes versus them bias, creating conflict narratives. And finally, presentism, judging events solely through a modern lens without historical context.
So, by being more conscious of these potential blind spots and inherent biases, we can hopefully develop a more nuanced and less reactive understanding, moving beyond simplistic narratives.
Precisely. Taking a step back allows us to see a more intricate picture, one with intended and unintended outcomes, winners and losers, and where our own psychology plays a significant role in how we perceive it all.
Let's maintain this broader perspective then. What is the larger global context in which these tariff-related conspiracy theories are emerging? And what might the situation look like on a more individual level for our hypothetical everyman?
Okay, zooming out to the global scale, we see a landscape characterized by increasing economic friction. We're witnessing trade disputes, a reshaping of global supply chains, and maybe a shift in the established economic order with the rise of blocs like BRICS.
Uh-huh.
International organizations like the WTO are facing challenges as nations increasingly prioritize their own interests. Socially, this environment of uncertainty can create fertile ground for polarization and discontent, which is then amplified globally online.
And bringing it down to a more personal level, what might be the tangible effects on someone like our everyman? Let's call him Joe.
Okay, Joe, he might not be deep into conspiracies, but he's certainly likely to feel the impact of increased prices, higher grocery bills, maybe pricier clothes or electronics. Perhaps worries about job security if his employer is affected.
Yeah, the everyday stuff.
Exactly. He might notice his usual imported olive oil or sneakers cost more or are harder to find. So even without subscribing to elaborate plots, these everyday economic realities can create pressure and unease.
So there's a disconnect between the grand theories and Joe's reality.
There can be. The big narratives might grab headlines, but the more immediate impact is often felt in these daily struggles of rising costs and economic uncertainty faced by the average person.
This makes me wonder, if we really want to gain a deeper understanding, what should we be observing more closely, both at that individual micro level and at the broader macro level?
Well, if we zoom in to the micro level, we should pay attention to the subtle shifts in the daily lives of individuals like Joe. Maybe noticing them switching to cheaper brands, carpooling more, or looking for side hustles.
Little adaptations.
Yeah. We should also observe the kinds of online content they engage with, probably focusing on relatable economic grievances rather than the wilder conspiracy claims. Observing the local economic landscape, which small businesses are thriving, which are struggling, the general mood can also offer valuable insights.
And when we zoom out to the macro perspective,
From that broader vantage point, we need to monitor the large-scale shifts in global trade flows, the strategic actions of major economic players and potential beneficiaries, and the sheer volume and diversity of conspiracy theories circulating online. Plus, we need to keep an eye on those longer-term, slower-burning consequences that might not show up immediately.
so by paying attention to both the granular details and the sweeping trends, we can develop a more comprehensive understanding, even if proving or disproving the motives remains tricky.
Precisely. It's about observing the tangible effects and the wider patterns rather than getting lost solely in speculative narratives. This disruption caused by tariffs, both real and perceived, feels like it could create an opportunity for significant adaptation and change, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. How might individuals, like our everyman Joe, and even entire cultures, begin to adjust their habits and priorities in response to these economic shifts?
That's a really insightful question. When familiar and affordable options become less accessible, it often forces people to become more resourceful, right? Explore alternatives.
Necessity is the mother of invention.
Exactly. On an individual level, for Joe, this could involve rediscovering older, cheaper entertainment, maybe more DIY projects, skill sharing in the community, or just finding more value in what he already owns instead of buying new stuff constantly.
Yeah.
Like maybe he gets into retro gaming if new consoles get too pricey or starts making things.
Right, fixing things instead of replacing them.
Uh-huh. And on a broader cultural level, we might see a resurgence of local artisans, small-scale industries, a greater appreciation for thrift stores and secondhand goods, a growth in maker movements, and DIY communities.
More local focus.
Yeah, and even a renewed emphasis on storytelling and community connections as people seek less expensive entertainment and social interaction. Your source mentioned increased Etsy sales during past uncertainties as an example of that shift. It's like a forced pivot towards more localized, perhaps more sustainable, and community-oriented ways of living.
It's as if necessity becomes the mother of invention, not just in technology, but in our daily habits and cultural norms.
Precisely. Those individuals and communities that can adapt, find innovative ways to meet needs, and find satisfaction may not only weather this storm, but potentially thrive. However, as that rather stark KMFDM quote in your source reminds us, no pity for the masses, there's a harsh reality too. Meaning those unable or unwilling to adapt may face greater challenges. We've seen historical examples like small business creation rising after downturns as some adapted, contrasted with those who struggled during the disruptions of the early 2020s.
So in essence, these disruptions can act as a catalyst, fostering resilience, but also potentially worsening existing inequalities depending on one's capacity to adapt.
Exactly. It's a form of economic and social adaptation, where flexibility and resourcefulness become increasingly valuable skills for navigating turbulent times.
This has been a truly illuminating deep dive into the intricate world of tariff conspiracy theories. It's clear that the situation is far more complex than simple explanations might suggest, involving a tangled web of potential motivations, wide-ranging consequences, and diverse perceptions.
Absolutely. Gaining a comprehensive understanding requires us to consider multiple perspectives, stay mindful of our own biases, and look beyond the headlines to examine both the immediate and the long-term repercussions.
So here's a final thought for you, our listener. In a world increasingly shaped by complex global events and amplified by online narratives, how can you actively cultivate the ability to critically evaluate information and effectively adapt to ongoing change? And what seemingly old-fashioned skills or perhaps overlooked resources might hold unexpected value in a rapidly evolving landscape? It's definitely a question worth pondering long after our deep dive today concludes.